Hey, welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. This is a podcast where we like to have conversations that are not watered down, that are foolproof, so to speak. This is episode 2 of season 2, and I'm really excited about our guest today, Micah Caswell. Micah is the lead pastor at Redeemer Church in Denton, Texas, where he planted in 2013. He has 5 master's degrees, working on his second doctorate, and so we're going to get to talk about his obsession with that,
Right.
and what his almost neurotic behavior is with
Right.
education. He teaches biblical worldview at Denton Calvary Academy and is also a certified biblical counselor. Married to Kristen, has 2 kids. Micah, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks, man. I'm really blessed to be here and that you'd asked me, and so I'm looking forward to today.
It's great. We're doing something unique with a book that you've written, and so we're actually doing a giveaway. We're doing a giveaway with a book that you've written on Thomas Patient. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm excited about the new book. So we have some extra copies that H&E, the publisher, is letting us get out, and so I'd love for folks to read it. We'll talk about it more in a minute, but it's Thomas Patient is somebody that no one knows about. He's very much an ordinary Christian, and in many ways kind of lost to history, and so it's fun in that way that it'll probably be something new, a topic that you hadn't wrestled with before if you're reading it. It's also not a massive book. It's historical, so there's a lot of primary source stuff cited, but it is a neat story, and I think very readable for a pastor, but also a lay believer. So yeah.
That's great. And if you want to be entered into the giveaway, all that you need to do, there's 2 ways to do it. You can either do it on Facebook. You can comment on this video wherever you're streaming it, or you can comment on YouTube. And by commenting, we'll just enter you in the giveaway, and we'll be announcing those winners at the end of February. So comment before then to be entered in the giveaway. Well, one of the ways I like to start off the show is really, and we kind of mentioned already, hearing more about people's academic journey, their story, dissertations, all that kind of stuff. So why don't we start with kind of the latest thing you're working on, which is your PhD at Midwestern, and that's on Martyn Lloyd-Jones. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm still early in the process, but I'm pretty committed to going that direction and some specific things with his preaching. I always feel kind of rattled when I have to admit how many degrees I have, but it's kind of been a strange journey, and I don't know if this is helpful for anyone, but I mean, certainly, you can put me in a category of a lifelong learner, but early in ministry and kind of that MDiv stage, my wife and I really had a perspective that, hey, if I was going to law school or med school, that would be my full-time job. We would focus on it. We kind of delayed starting a family, and Kristen taught school and, took care of us, and I worked part-time at a church, but we just kind of treated it like a full-time job. And so I took May terms and winter terms and went in the summer and that sort of thing. And so anyway, we did a lot of work then, but then once we got more into full-time ministry, I just found that season of life was good for my soul. And so we kind of landed on, hey, if it really does help our ministry and it's affordable, we don't want to go in debt on it, and it doesn't harm our family in any way. Like if you're, gone all weekend, working on stuff and there's no family time, then we don't want to do it. Then those were kind of our criteria. And we kind of caught what I think was a neat wave in seminary education where it was very tailored towards pastors. And then, online education came and all of these things. So we've been able to do that. And so I never take like full loads of things, but I always take a class at a time. And so we'd rather spend the monies that we have to go to conferences and things as I just take a class, and you wake up and I have too many degrees. But so anyway, if you're a pastor, I just plug along and take things that are encouraging to you. And so.
That's great, man. Particularly with Martyn Lloyd-Jones, what is it, with this latest kind of research you're pursuing, what is it that really sparked your curiosity on Martyn Lloyd-Jones?
I have, for about 3 years, almost every day I was listening to a Martyn Lloyd-Jones sermon. So as I was driving around, that was kind of part of my devotional life, and just love Lloyd-Jones. find him to be a really helpful model for expository preaching. And so I feel like my calling is as a pastor theologian, not a theologian pastor, but and so I really found his preaching not only just encouraging to me personally, but also a helpful model for what expository preaching can and should look like. So I was a fan and blessed by him and loved his story. And during the not this this past election, but the first one, the first Trump election, just as a pastor and a Christian, I think for the first time, it was very complex on how to navigate that election, obviously. And so we found at a staff level, just about every staff meeting, it was like a permanent, point on our agenda. Okay, do we address this controversy? Do we address this issue? Do we address this person in our church or in our community that said something crazy on social media? How do we address those things? If we address it, what do we say about it? So it was a real challenge, I felt like, as a pastor, to navigate the political moment. And so anyway, in that, I stumbled upon not only Lloyd-Jones's Romans sermons, but his treatment of Romans 13. And also in those years and that period, I was surprised by how frequently Lloyd-Jones referenced political issues that were going on around him in his preaching. And so I kind of leaned towards, man, I don't want to have any sort of politics in my sermons. And we worked hard. I don't want to be the political pastor or the political church. And so there was a real tendency to not address anything. I mean, that was my knee jerk in my heart. Golly, let's talk about the gospel and avoid what's going on around us. And I think there's some healthiness to that. But with Lloyd-Jones, he was doing something slightly different in the 50s and 60s. I mean, he was pretty aggressive about pacifism and a real kind of left view of nuclear weapons. He did not like that, and he was speaking to that in his sermons, and on top of ecumenicism and things like that. He was addressing the political moment, but he always did it very thoughtfully, in a very fair way, recognizing, hey, you can be at different places as a Christian on these issues. But then there were times where he did really jump on some. So pacifism, for example, he kind of blew up Christian arguments for pacifism, and that was in kind of the diet of his Sunday morning preaching, it just wasn't the approach I was taking, which stirred my curiosity of his treatment of Romans 13. So I'm early in the process, but I'm curious to his method of treating political issues, specifically in Romans 13. So that's kind of my early stab at a project. So.
I love it. And I'm looking forward to see what work you do there, what you discover there, because I know it would be helpful for me as I similarly try to address issues. We're both in Acts 29, and we have a similar missional ethos about how we talk about the world. And so I'm really excited that you're doing that work. One of the things with Lloyd-Jones, he's a curious guy to me. And one of his books, I think it's one of the more famous books. I can't remember the name of it right now. He talks about how sermons shouldn't even be recorded on cassette and distributed. He seems to be a very stubborn fellow. Like there's stories of him, whether it's bombs falling or maybe it was like he was preaching in Pennsylvania and the power went out and he just kept preaching as if nothing happened.
I haven't heard that
which
story.
on the one hand, you're like, that's awesome that you're that way, but it's also a little intimidating as a guy. One of the things he is famous for, though, is kind of this concept of logic on fire. There was a documentary about his life. Talk about that idea of preaching as logic on fire. That's what how he described preaching. What did he mean by that?
That's a phrase he uses in his book on preaching, which were a series of lectures he gave at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. A lot of that is that he called it a message, but in the message of his sermon, that needed to be a kind of they needed to be ideas that connected and flowed and went in a direction. But in similar to kind of the Puritan model of preaching, it really does kind of climax at the end with the application, and that was his approach, and I really buy into that and hold to that as well. But he climaxes with preaching how this then applies. And so, you and I are from Texas, and so maybe um, we listen to his sermons and you're like, man, that's fire for him. But because he's Welsh and British, he's maybe a little more buttoned up than we are. But that was fire and anyone would see, oh my, you're stirred at the end of his sermon. So even if you track the volume of Lloyd-Jones's sermon, and this is nerdy, but I've done this a little bit, like, okay, at this time in his sermon, he begins to speak louder, and the pace quickens, but that wasn't a contrived thing for him.
Sure.
All the reasoning, if you will, up to that point led to these very important points that he wanted that congregation to hear. So he was a pastor first, and
Mm,
so he's logical, he's thoughtful. Maybe some people think it's hard to track him, but his point was he wanted to then apply that text and that reasoning to the congregation. And when he was doing that, he's excited at that point. I mean, he's excitable in that way, and so that's the fire of it, is he's calling people to repent and believe, and those things. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah, like I said, I'm really looking forward to whatever research you do on it,
yeah. Thank you.
and I'm sure the listeners here would love to hear it as well, because it is a really important thing. I've started to explore a lot of different concepts, from theonomy to other issues,
Mm,
just because I feel like I've been so maybe oblivious, maybe trying to ignore the issue,
mm,
and just haven't given it enough attention. And so I'm really excited for what you're researching. One of the things that you brought up with Lloyd-Jones is kind of his pastoral heart. And any pastor knows this, that part of your job is going to be counseling people,
mm,
whether it's licensed counseling or not, just pastoral counseling, meeting with people, helping them with their life, navigating complex issues they're facing with a biblical perspective and a pastoral
mm.
heart. And that kind of gets into one of the. I think you got a degree in biblical counseling. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. I maybe the journey there is I don't feel I'm not sure I'm a good biblical counselor yet, but I think early on I felt like it was a real weakness, and so I would go to a conference, or I do some training, and I eventually got a certification through the Association of Biblical Counselors. But I've done some training through ACBC as well. But again, seminary just had a program that was affordable, very tailored to a pastor, because I had done an MDiv and things before. Much of it transferred in, and so it was just kind of an easy thing to do. I think I can't remember how many classes I did over a couple year period, but yeah, and it's been really, initially it was so that I could be a better counselor, which I was doing more, and I didn't feel like I was being effective. I wanted to grow in that area and serve our people better. And once I got into it, I had more of a passion for it. And some of it was just getting to counsel our people, disciple young men, seeing, especially some hard things happen to young men and teenagers, and just, God, I guess, gave me more of a heart for that, and more of a passion for it. And so anyway, I'm doing it more regularly now, even in a biblical counseling office here in the area, and really love it. It's a real joy.
That's great. Biblical counseling has been something I've been curious about as well, because I tend to be more of a logical thinker. People can
Yeah.
perceive me as not caring,
Mm,
which is, it's helpful feedback. And so I've always kind of had
yeah.
a heart to, like, I'm a pastor. I want to care for people well.
Yeah.
But
Amen.
kind of in my education at different seminary, they have a large imprint in counseling, and a lot of that's helpful. But a lot of it kind of, like, there was almost a tension between biblical counseling and some other
Hmm.
streams of counseling. And so it led me to kind of study David Powlison, Paul Tripp,
Hmm.
Jay Adams, but also Christian psychologists and other people. So when you're talking about biblical counseling and being certified as a biblical counselor, what is it you mean by that? What is biblical counseling? Maybe how is it different than other forms of counseling?
Yeah. I mean, as you said, there's different streams. I'm comfortable in the category of biblical counseling. I sometimes have to qualify that with people because maybe they've had an experience with someone, and I maybe view an issue differently. But I don't really, although my degree it's in Christian counseling, which was more of an integrated approach, but I have certifications in biblical counseling as well. And for me, that was really helpful because I got to study, just the normal theories of counseling that every LPC, Christian or not, wrestles with and kind of chooses, an approach that they believe in and that they're going to practice. And so, so I'm versed in the DSM-5 and all those things, which I think is helpful. And we do live in a real psychologized culture. And so I think it's helpful to understand those issues and as people bring them up. And I think what I tell my clients is I don't have an axe to grind really against those things in the sense that I do know the history of them, and I think it is important for Christians to know the history of psychology in general and in this country, and as it relates to especially psychotropic medicine. I think that there's a place for it. I also think it's people are over medicated, and I think we're in our culture we're quick to try to medicate something when it should not be. So and there's an interesting history of even how those medicines have developed. It's a very different thing than normal, kind of like heart medicine and the process that you get there.
Right.
So anyway, I have some, it's just not where I am. But at the same time, I recognize, hey, I believe there's such a thing as bipolar disease. I believe it, and so and there's a place for taking lithium or whatever it is. So again, I don't have an axe to grind, but that's not really what I do. One of the things that I do have a real conviction on, and I tell my clients is I do believe in that. The reality is that maybe upwards to 80 to 90% of why someone comes to a counselor, they're better served by just opening up their Bible and really understanding the process of Christian salvation and Christian sanctification. Those are that are most helpful for them. So typically, when somebody comes to a counselor, they've had some sort of outburst of anger, and the cops have been called, or the wife has left, and we need to understand what anger is and how to manage anger. And maybe there's a place for medicine on that one, real extreme cases, but in most cases, you need to understand biblically who you are as a person and what the gospel says to that and how the Holy Spirit helps you that. And then you need someone to bear patiently with you on that and admonish you on that. And so really the biblical solutions are the solutions to 80 to 90% of why people typically go to counseling. And so I have just found what I have learned in that sphere to be way more helpful in people's lives as I meet with them. So
That's great.
what was your answer? Were you asking for a definition of biblical counseling? I can't
Yeah,
remember.
but I mean, you kind of
Sorry.
answered it. Like you're just
Okay.
sharing your perspective on it, which is fantastic. I think one of the things that would help me understand is like there's a whole stream of kind of biblical counseling, which is like nouthetic
Hmm.
counseling,
Hmm.
uh, and I think the heart behind it was good when it was created.
Yeah, I think
The
so.
sufficiency of Scripture and how we need to rely
Yeah.
on the Bible, but I'd love to hear from you. Kind of what are some of the liabilities, vulnerabilities in that approach to
Hmm.
counseling?
Um, I lean more in those directions, but I guess you just hear of you'll just hear of an account and it's like, yeah, that's clearly bipolar, or you'll hear an account of, yeah, listen, that guy really does need medicine. And so, but again, people go to those things quicker than what they should, and we're over medicated. And um, so I think those are the liabilities, is that there's a total closing off to things. So like, well, for instance, this is kind of common for a lot of Christian counselors, that they see some virtues in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the main theories of counseling today. I find a lot of usefulness in cognitive behavioral therapy and solution focus therapy. So cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, has a lot of really empirical evidence of research that's done, that method being applied and seeing real results. And so I think that there's an aspect of that kind of research that is general revelation, and I find really helpful. And so now I put a maybe a well, not maybe I put a biblical twist on that of saying cognitive behavioral therapy, in my opinion, recognizes that humanity has an inner and an outer aspect of who you are. So how you think about things, the perspective you have of it, you then behave accordingly. Well, that's not that far. It's a different thing, but it's not that far away from, your head, your thoughts, your heart, emotions, and beliefs, things like that, and then your behavior. And so that's what I emphasize, with my clients. I try to put biblical language on it because I think it's helpful. Um, but I think that reality of recognizing the soul, recognizing your perspective of something. Now we would say believe. What do you believe about that thing that happened to you? Do you believe God was good and sovereign when that bad thing happened to you? Do you believe that you should and can, through the power of the Holy Spirit, forgive that person? Do you believe, so your beliefs, and your perspective and how you think about it really matter, and that drives everything. Solution focused therapy is similar. There's some, I think, research that's done on that's really helpful. And I even, with my clients, I tell them, hey, I don't really know that you and I are going to be meeting together forever. Like let's identify your problem. What's going on? Let's really push into it hard for a season. And then, I want you to see that you're getting better. We're going to work towards a solution. And so there's some aspects about that theory that I find helpful too. So maybe, if you kind of cut off all that, and maybe you're not open to maybe some of the good things about it. But listen, granted, there's a lot of negative that comes from those things. So you really have to know how to navigate it well.
For sure. Yeah. I think for me, in my journey with kind of, I wouldn't call it nouthetic or any even biblical counseling, but just kind
Hmm.
of the general care that most Christians use or that I grew up with was more of kind of a fundamentalist approach
Mm,
to sin and problems in your life, where if you just memorized enough
yeah,
Bible, that's gonna be enough for you. And of course, we would all say, yeah, memorize the Bible. That's great.
sure.
But expecting that to be some kind of magic pill that gets you out of trouble, that's a
Yeah,
really inept approach.
my first experience with synthetic counseling, that was my takeaway as well. Is it had a little bit of, in the culture of it, Bible verse a day keeps the devil away, and related to that, it could become kind of legalistic in that way, and judgmental in that way. And so anyway, the same verse that we all go to for preaching is preach the word, 2 Timothy 2:4 or 4:2. But then it goes on to say, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. And so I do think I think there is a caricature in that world that we're not bearing patiently, with one another. So we're explaining the scripture and applying the scripture. But I'm finding the more I do biblical counseling, much of it is bearing patiently.
Mhm.
Sometimes when I meet with someone, they don't need, they know that Bible verse, and they know they actually hold to an orthodox position of it. But it's similar in my preaching. I'm telling our mature Christians, hey, Sunday morning isn't always about new information for you. It's about, through the sermon, being reminded again of the gospel. And lots of times the counseling moment is that. It's just reminding them and listening and praying for them and encouraging. They know the answer, but it's just, and I need that. I mean, I just need to be reminded of the gospel again. And so bearing patiently, I think, is a huge aspect of biblical counseling that sometimes we do well and sometimes we don't.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's great. One of the things you mentioned was kind of cognitive behavioral therapy. You actually mentioned something I'm really passionate about in my book. The podcast isn't meant to be a plug for my book, but
No.
I just wanted to highlight a commonality in my approach to Christian formation with kind of this idea of head, heart, hands,
Mm,
and really how all three are really they're essential.
hmm.
They integrate, and really God designed human development to operate where we are processing
Yeah.
with our beliefs, our affections, and our behaviors in
Hmm.
concert. And what a lot of times uh, I see counseling can get off track is they really highlight two of those. So like it'll be
Hmm.
like head and behavior. So believe the right thing,
Mm,
behave. And in other practices, it's way too much, affection. What do you desire? What
hmm.
do you, which is crucial. like essential,
Hmm.
but it can almost be like we're not going to focus on the behavior or what you believe.
Hmm.
And so I really think all three of those are crucial. Um,
I I think that's a great point too, and I think the great point that sometimes we just emphasize two over the three. But Lloyd-Jones was actually good on this of just recognizing that, okay, the way a heart softens, right? Like, so if someone has a hard heart about something, that's leading to these hand behavior things that are really destructive and sinful. Okay, well, how do you soften the heart? Well, you got to go through the head, and you have to wrestle. Okay, buddy, stop. Let's go back to the gospel. What does Jesus say to this? And how did he treat you when you did this? And so you're dealing with the head there, and what ends up happening is it then affects the emotions, and when
mhm.
the emotions are then affected, it then then the behaviors follow. And so even how those all connect together is very biblical and very important. And listen, I think that is the weakness of many approaches to modern psychology, where it views the human solely as biological, and so it diverts the importance of reflecting upon these things, backing up and thinking. If you can just take a pill to fix, and I know that's an oversimplification, but if you can just take a pill to fix this, then you never ponder, okay, yeah, but what's my thinking on this that led me there?
Right.
Um, so anyway.
That's great. One of the things that you're focused on in the giveaway today with your book on Thomas Patient, um, uh, is on his pastoral ministry, his pastoral heart, um, and really your historical scholarship on pastoring and discipleship is really going to be helpful for people on the topic or person of Thomas Patient, because I'm not familiar with Thomas Patient. In fact, while I was typing up the show notes, I kept not even spelling his name right.
Yeah.
That's how uneducated I am. I'd love to hear kind of a brief synopsis of who is Thomas Patient and what did he do?
Yeah, I saw kind of here on the live comments deal, in Clary made a comment about the patient. I think Ian and myself and Michael Haken, we're the three people who know who Thomas Patient is. Probably no one knows who he is, and his name is misspelled all over the place.
Okay.
There's some difficulty on some of that. Sometimes it's spelled patient, and sometimes it's spelled patience. I
Okay.
think I think he I think he thought the correct spelling was patient, and so that's why I chose that. All that's kind of common with those guys. I mean, he spelled Kiffin or whatever. Um, yeah, so he was. There's little known about maybe family of origin and his beginnings, but and much of this is kind of he opens his book on the doctrine of baptism, what's kind of an autobiographical sketch of a portion of his life, how he began to hold Baptist or Baptistic convictions. And where you really pick up his life is that he is part of what was called the Great Migration of Puritans to the American colonies, especially in the 1630s. And so he's part of that group that comes. Now, that group is typically identified as what we would call Congregationalists or independents. Most of them were not, from the aristocracy, so wouldn't be like kind of the mega wealthy, of their day. But they clearly were very zealous and pious people, and they had enough means, to pay for the journey to get over there. So that's kind of probably describes where he's at. When he comes to the American colonies, he says that he holds to the New England way, which would have been a congregationalist view of baptism, or which was infant baptism. While he's over here, a debate begins to happen on what is now the Puritans. That is a glorious attempt by people to try to live out a biblical spirituality in a biblical view of the gospel, and then a biblical ecclesiology. How do we live together? How do we do church? These sorts of things, which is of course outgrowth. Those are outgrowths of the gospel, and they're connected to our biblical spirituality. So how it's maybe boring big boy stuff on how you choose to organize your church, but it does affect your spirituality. So when he's in the New England colonies, a debate breaks out on what is the most biblical form of baptism. And with an kind of an honest reflection of that, he changes his theology and holds to a Baptist form of baptism. Now, I think there's an interesting aspect and a couple stops in his life on religious liberty. This is the first one because a warrant is issued for his arrest for holding to that. So if Baptists today, if you think you've got some challenges, know that if you were, and maybe that's all of us, would you hold to believer's baptism if you could go to jail for that? Well, Thomas Patient did. Now he flees. I found his warrant for his arrest, which was kind of a nerdy, fun aspect of this
That is
historical
fun.
study. And he and his wife travel back to England. They connect with one of the main Baptist churches there in London, with Kiffin's church. He's probably best categorized as a co-pastor with him. Patient was older than Kiffin, but while he's there, this is now early 1640s. He is one of the 15 signers of what we now refer to as the First London Confession. And those were different churches, and they sent representatives. Usually there were, I think one of them there was three. One church sent three, but everybody else sent two. So he and Kiffin signed it together, representing their church. And that what they argue there for believers' baptism and how they explain it, that really is even today our understanding of believers' baptism. To me, it's interesting, maybe how little it's changed. During that time, this is the British Civil War period. If your listeners know that period, that's an interesting time. Oliver Cromwell rises to power during that time in leading the forces against the monarchy. The king is killed in that time, which is fascinating. And so most of the Puritans, the Presbyterians, the Independents, the Baptists, they are siding with Cromwell in that and fighting in the army with him. And so he takes England, and then he goes into Ireland, and he has a very, I think, scandalous and shameful conquering of Ireland. This is one stop on many stops of English brutality over the Irish. And he takes John Owen with him, which maybe a lot of your listeners know John Owen. John Owen rightly sees that there's just not a gospel witness in Ireland. It's very Catholic, like most of the history of Ireland, but there's just not an evangelical gospel witness there. So he comes back to the British Parliament, preaches a sermon, and calls on Parliament to designate funds to pay army chaplains to join the army in Ireland with the goal of spreading the gospel in Ireland. So that's how Thomas Patient hears that, heeds that call, and goes to Ireland as an army chaplain. Another nerdy point is I found all the accounting books of how much he was paid, these handwritten books of how much he was paid.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it is. I had to wear gloves in Oxford for that. But yeah, so that's how he gets there. And while he's there, he plants a couple of churches. And as Ian noted on here, he's referencing the Swift Alley in Dublin. That's the first Baptist church building in Ireland. He plants a church in Waterford, and then in Dublin. While he's there, a controversy breaks out over believers' baptism. So he writes a full-length book on believers' baptism, which there had been pamphlets and other things written. But this is one of the earliest, if the earliest, full-length book on believers' baptism by anybody. So the title says he's the father of the Irish Baptists. There was possibly one church planted before that in Cork, but it wasn't as directly connected to the particular Baptist. But the churches that he planted are still there today, which to me is wonderful.
It's amazing.
And his basic theology is still in place. It's about, kind of a real commitment to Bible, Reformed theology, Baptistic theology, but also a real evangelistic fervor. And man, that has been in those churches ever since. The Irish Baptists are incredible. But that's kind of his life in a nutshell.
Man, that's a great summary and super interesting to me. I mean, from the issue of believers' baptism in the colonies to, like you mentioned, being persecuted in a real way about that biblical conviction, lessons to learn there. Then really this Civil War and Cromwell. I named my son one of my sons is named Owen, the other is named Knox.
Nice.
I hadn't done I've read one book by John Owen. I just thought, I was trying to float a list of names of historical theologians to my wife.
Yeah.
and those fit the bill for ones that she could deal with.
Well put. I
Um,
tried Hezekiah. I like King Hezekiah, and my wife shot that down.
I
Yeah,
bet.
we liked Knox a lot, and I like Owen too. Yeah.
Oh man, well that's awesome. His story on believers' baptism really interesting because at the well we helped plant a Presbyterian church, a PCA
Oh, cool.
church, but we're not Paedo Baptist at all. But planting that really helped
Thomas
us.
Patient would rebuke you for that, man. He wouldn't put up with that.
I know we live in
I
different
liked it, but
times,
he
don't
didn't
we?
like it. That's
It's
right.
so
Yeah,
funny.
very much so. It is funny.
Um, Yeah, so it's an interesting topic because most people today, I guess, don't give much thought to it. But it is it really shapes, like you said, governance and ecclesiology really shapes how we do spirituality. As far as that first kind of London Confession of Faith, was that the precursor to that second London Confession of Faith in 1689?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I mean, it's a shorter confession. You know, there are streams of influences for both those confessions that in many ways are separate, but it is the London is, is what a lot of guys reference more, and I think rightly so. It's more thorough. It's more in line with Westminster. So I think a lot of people give it some historical weight in that way. But the first London's I think is very orthodox and very helpful, and I like how it's structured. So it influences it in that it is it's the same theology basically. Second is more thorough and has more topics and articles. And there are some similar people in them, namely Kiffin, as part of both projects. So he lived long enough to be part of both.
That's awesome. I remember I read the first time I read the second
Hmm.
London Confession. Um, I was like telling my pastor friends, I was like, "Where has this been? Like, this is what I've been looking
Yeah,
for,
yeah,
as far as a kind of a tool of thinking, of
mm,
articulating the faith." Because at least in the Southern Baptist tradition I was raised in, the confessions were just like, "What is that? That's not a
yeah.
thing," which is
And
such a
there's been an
disservice.
It is, and there's been a real anti-confessionalism in a lot of Baptist circles, even to today. Some of that's healthy, I think, but some of it is we just have missed our history and some really useful tools that would be helpful, and in particular to church planters. I mean, when you go into an established church, they've got their doctrine set, they have how they function set. You're kind of stepping in and running ministries. It's a different question, but when you're a church planter, you have to wrestle with all that. What do we believe on this? It's more than just what do we name in our church? Are we going to be Presbyterian? Or are we going to be Baptist? And you need to know where you are on that. And you're going to have people come in and say, "Hey, I'm Presbyterian." You say, "Man, the Lord bless and keep you, and we want to have you here." And that's okay. We're not arguing with you. We think you're a Christian, but this is how we do it. So are you okay? Are you okay with that? And can you live according to that? And so you just have to make those decisions. And a lot of that is understanding the issues around it. And so I think church history is very helpful there. So how does congregation and elders relate? What role does baptism serve as kind of a gatekeeper on membership and all those things? So I find Baptist theology being able to navigate those tensions. I have found it incredibly helpful and useful, not only in ministry in general, but specifically in planting churches. It's been wonderful having that history to draw from.
Absolutely. I remember when we planted, I was like, we were so concerned with name and all this kind of stuff. And you have to
Sure,
make those decisions. It's,
sure.
and it may have been overdone, overwrought at the time. When in reality, what I really needed was more of that
Mm,
resourcing, in terms
mm,
of like, hey, this is how the church has done ministry. This is what the church
mm.
has believed. This is the faith handed down to us,
Amen.
biblically. So I think that's so crucial. What's something that you might suggest? I mean, obviously, there's just so much to talk about with Thomas Patient, but what are some key things about his ministry that you might find helpful for people, whether in ministry or church today? What do you think we can learn from him?
Through writing this, I've just gotten to know a lot of the Irish Baptists and have become friends with some guys and have talked. We've just talked ministry and what are they doing over there. To my delight, a lot of the pieces that Thomas Patient put together, if you will, theologically, and then how that plays out practically in ministry, it has stood the test of time. Now, I would say that's because it's biblical and thus the Spirit has been in it. But the brothers and sisters in Ireland, for example, they have put those pieces together and are living those out in a very healthy way. So there's a real amongst the Irish Baptists, there's a real thoughtful commitment to the Word of God and holding to inerrancy and infallibility and the role that God's Word plays in ministry. They really have a great. Everyone that I've engaged with has just a wonderful and thoughtful, courageous understanding of the gospel and how that drives everything. But then putting together Baptist theology in that. Uh, but I think sometimes there's a caricature of kind of the Reformed Baptist guy that they're not good at missionally engaging the lost, and so and this is bread and butter for a bunch of 829 church planters, right? Like this is why we plant churches, is to reach the lost, and that was Thomas Patient's heart. I mean, he went
Mm.
to Ireland to see people converted to Christ, and he was brokenhearted. He wanted to see people converted, and that's why he planted those churches. And the Irish Baptists are still planting churches with that same heart. So those doctrinal convictions are there, but that heart too. I mean, we love our neighbors, and we want them to know Jesus, and we want to help them get there. And that's the heart of those brothers and sisters over there. And to me, again, it's a neat example of hundreds of years later that vision is still being played out. Now, it's not Thomas Patient's vision; it's Paul's vision, it's
Yeah.
Jesus's vision, right?
Right.
But it is neat to see that. I think he put a lot of those pieces together. Was very courageous, and how in doing. I mean, that's a lot of travel. That's very unique for someone to have gone from England to America, back to England, to Ireland, back to England. And planting churches along the way. So it was very courageous of him. To me, I find that very inspiring, and just putting those pieces together, and then having something that outlives him. I mean, there's going to be a day that I retire and die, and I want Redeemer Church to still be here, ministering the gospel to Denton County. And Thomas Patient was able to do that. There's some churches he planted that are still there. Those churches are planting churches. I find that very inspiring.
For sure. And Thomas Patient really seems to embody kind of this idea that he was something bigger than himself.
Mm,
Whereas a lot of us as church planners, or at least I can feel this way, we can get kind of so wrapped up in like what we're doing, where we're at. But he seemed to have a receptivity, a conviction about what he believed. He heard a sermon from John Owen in Parliament
hmm
and really responded to that call,
mm.
but was able to hold a conviction, right, and articulate that conviction to equip people, but also kind of like be part of something bigger than himself, which I think is really, really admirable.
Yeah, um, I mean, I'm on a esteemed podcast right now, but I don't speak at I'm kind of a nobody. Okay, I'm an ordinary pastor. It's taking me a little bit to be at peace with that, and then kind of like that actually. And some of that came from Dr. Michael Haken, who I think is one of the great church historians of our day for sure. But he has a very helpful idea for me that really the great things that are accomplished in history, it's really usually less about the great man theory of history, where Churchill beat the Nazis, or Eisenhower, beat the Nazis. Eisenhower didn't beat the Nazis. Who beat the Nazis? It was a bunch of no-name 19-year-old GIs from Iowa who stormed beaches. That's who beat the Nazis, okay?
Mm.
His point is that ordinary men and women who share a vision, link arms with each other, and go in the same direction together, that's when great things are accomplished in history, but as well as in church history. And Patient was that. I mean, he is, this is there's been a couple of articles written on him, but this is the first full length book, and it's not a long book. Okay, I mean, he's an ordinary guy, but he embraced a vision for a direction. He joined that and went in that direction, and God did really great things for that. And frankly, I know this isn't a commercial for the Southern Baptist Convention or Acts 29, but for me, those two networks in that denomination are that for me. Are there imperfections in both of those? Of course there are. They're made of human beings, but those are wonderful things that I'm proud to be part of because they're going in a direction that I believe in. And I think, as Tim Keller notes, that Christianity has a unique ability to self-correct. And I think in both of those organizations, there's been great self-correction when needed. But at the same time, they have majored in the right majors. And, you and I are part of something that's going in a direction, and we're getting to participate in what God's doing here on earth. Praise God, right?
Yeah, it's awesome, man. And I think that's really encouraging, just as like kind of like you mentioned, for kind of everyday normal people,
Mm,
whether pastor or not, listening to this podcast. Our world can really feel, uh, it kind of goes back into counseling, something I preached on a couple weeks ago. Our world can really reinforce feelings of shame in people because
mm,
of celebrity and power, and really the
mm,
sense that like our voice isn't heard. What we say doesn't matter, what we do doesn't matter, almost
mm,
this nihilism. In Christianity, and what we're trying to remind each other of and then remind everyone else of, is that the choices you make every day, who you're in community with, does matter, and it can shape
mm.
history. Now, of course, you can get these grandiose thoughts that are probably unrealistic and maybe even unhelpful. But I
Yeah.
mean, like there's something to be said for linking arms with the people that are around you and doing normal things in a
Mm,
faithful direction, that really impacts society more than really having this huge platform.
mm.
Um, and all that stuff matters too. That has
Sure,
its own issues,
sure, sure.
but I think that's a great encouragement to me as really over the last 2020, you feel like people are making decisions in far off places that affect your
Mm,
life,
mm-hmm,
and you may disagree with those decisions, and you're like, I feel powerless. I feel
mm-hmm.
completely powerless to do anything about it. That's just a really
Yeah,
helpful reminder for me. So
yeah,
thanks for that.
yeah. Amen.
Um,
Amen.
One of the things that Thomas Paine was part of was the Puritan movement, and that's something I'm particularly curious about,
Yeah,
particularly with spiritual formation and discipleship. One of the things that's unique about them is they helped kind of shape the American psyche, the
yeah.
social
I think so.
imaginary, and really culture at large. Um, and what I wanted to talk with you about is this concept of Christian worldview, because you
Mm,
you teach it to seniors at a local high school there, which I think is really fun. Christian worldview is something that I was privy to in high school, but really
mm,
in seminary, Dr. Doug Grotice really helped me kind of
mm.
embrace kind of that concept. Um, First of all, like what inspired you to go kind of connect with a local high school and teach a bunch of seniors about worldview?
Um, the cynical answer is I was a church planter and needing to support my salary. And a friend said, real late in August, we just had a vacancy fill. We need somebody to teach Christian worldview. Can you do it? And before even knowing what it was, or I said, yeah. And I said, okay, what book are they using? They don't have a material. You got to create it all. Oh, can I take my answer back? And so it just kind of started there. It was just a need that I had, but it did sound fun. But I mean, within maybe 2 months, it became a passion for me. And now it's just ministry, and I love it. And yeah, like you said, it's fun. It is fun. And I love my students, and I love catching them at the senior year of high school. I mean, what an amazing moment in your life where you're wrestling with things. You're about to, fly the coop and make these choices on your own. And so it's just you're ready to go, but you're sad to go. It's just all these neat, weird things happening in their lives that are wonderful, and then get to talk about all these, very important, issues, and navigate the moment. And so it started with maybe a need that I had, that God had a bigger vision for it, and now it's something I'm incredibly passionate about and really love my students. So,
That's awesome. Yeah, that age is so important, and being in Boulder with a college town, really that
hmm
18-year-old, if I can
oh
articulate
man,
in sermons or in teaching to reach an 18-year-old,
hmm
I can pretty much cover a wide gamut of people, because
hmm
that's a really, it's trying to push people to a level of intellectual engagement that may be a
hmm
little bit beyond the NIV eighth grade reading level. But it really is important. When we talk about Christian worldview, what is it we're talking about? Like, how would you define Christian worldview, and why does it matter?
Well, the 101 answer is that, everyone has a worldview, and there's all sorts of worldviews out there. There's kind of, big, kind of sweeping worldviews like a religion or secularism. But then there's mini, MINI worldviews like Trumpism or the Democratic Party, or all the different corners of the Democratic Party, or the different corners of the Republican Party. Those are all different worldviews. So every worldview kind of has to answer, or does answer, four key questions: creation, which answers where do we come from; fall, which answers what's wrong with this place; redemption is, okay, what's our solution to what's wrong; and then restoration or consummation, which is what is the ideal version of the future. And so everyone has a story, or a way to answer that. So, for instance, this is interesting that my students now were born after 9/11. I mean, that was so formative for my generation. Well, there's been a debate on, okay, how do we get Muslim terrorists flying planes into building? Okay, do all Muslim people want to do that? Well, no, they don't. But what is there something in Islam that's in that? Well, actually, yes, there is. Jihad has been here since the beginning of Islam, and so, but a secular worldview just doesn't have the categories of believing that people really operate out their religion.
Hmm.
So what is it? How does a typical secular person view people? Well, it's about oppression, and it's about material. It's about materialism. So what you hear from a lot of secular people on the problem of Islamic terrorism is, well, if it's because they're mistreated, and if they had a better economy, and if we weren't stealing their oil, then maybe they wouldn't do that. Well, goodness, I mean, Osama bin Laden had more money than you and me and our churches combined. So it certainly didn't apply to him. It was a religious issue for him. And so, you know, every, every worldview answers these things. And, so that's an example of a secular worldview. How are they addressing that problem? How are they working towards a solution? I would disagree, obviously, with how they approach that. But we all have these worldviews. But a biblical worldview is answering those questions biblically. We come from God. He spoke creation into existence. The problem is not that we don't have an education or some sort of material answer. It's that we sin. We have sin, and the solution is not, getting somebody to read and write, or have a good school, or have enough money to have what they need. The solution is Jesus, and because Jesus saves us from our sins, and then all the wonderful things that come from that. And the ideal version of the future is not that we can vote in a politician to fix all this, or have some law that will fix all this. Politics is important. Who you vote for is important. All those things matter, but not in a religious way or an ultimate way. Ultimately, the solution is Aslan returns. And it's and I'm yeah. So it's what's the great saying that before Aslan returns, it's always winter but never Christmas. But
Hmm.
our hope is that King Jesus returns, and it flips that. So that's the Christian worldview.
That's great. That's a great summary. It's one that I use every membership class. We're teaching
Mm,
how do we answer these questions, and that
mm,
gets us into a lot of fun conversations about uh,
mm-hmm,
transgenderism and
mm,
marijuana and all
mm-hmm,
sorts of interesting topics for sure. You touched on kind of a secular worldview and oppression. One of the questions, we got a few minutes left here that I'd be curious to explore with you is at what point does a system of thinking become a worldview? Because there could be an argument
mm,
made that for every person in the world, there's a different worldview. And one kind of lab experiment you could play with is this topic that's come up in a strong way lately is critical race theory,
mm-hmm.
derived from critical theory. And some argue that critical theory operates as a worldview, and others would say it's not a worldview; it's just a tool, whether good or bad. You can debate that. Uh, but how would you help listeners, help me understand? Does critical theory operate as a worldview? Is that a coherent way to describe kind of that social way of understanding reality?
I think a lot of things, it can be both,
Okay.
and so I think it can be used as a sociological tool that is helpful. Um, so let's keep it in sociology, and that's maybe my take. I do think, and of course, as Christians, we're purists, and we're going back to the history of ideas and these things, which is right. We're convictional people. So I don't think it's in any way inappropriate to trace the history of critical race theory and see it is really built on some sandy ground. So even though I think there's some usefulness from it, I think we have to be careful with it. It is a philosophy of the world that I think it's in that category. Now, like for me, and this is just me, I'm not an expert on critical race theory at all. I'm like everybody. I think I'm trying to learn and navigate these issues. But for me, one of the I equate it in some ways to something like cognitive behavioral therapy. I think that's a philosophy of the world. I find some things about it that are useful. I wouldn't say that I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, but I would say I find some things useful about it, and I use them in counseling if they're useful and consistent with the Bible. And I think a similar thing with critical race theory. I think it's helping us look at some realities, with maybe different angles and fresh eyes that is useful. I don't believe in kind of a secular Marxist or socialist view of history that everything is this oppression I mean, they totally got theology out of their understanding of things, and even theology itself is just a form of oppression. Wait a second. Like, I don't think that that's historically accurate or fair-minded at all to put theology as a whole as a form of oppression. Now, can we point to moments where it has been? Absolutely. Is there such a thing as spiritual oppression? Yes. And you and I are pastors, and we need to be really careful not to bully or manipulate people, because we are in a position of spiritual authority in people's lives. However, as a whole, the history of the church is this power play. I mean, and so there's just I think there's some presuppositions that are within critical race theory that I find very troubling, and I just can't sync with a biblical worldview. But I think it is a good tool to begin talking about racism, systemic racism. I think racism is real and still happens. It's clearly a sin, and we need to say that. We need to walk with people who have struggled with the pain of racism. I mean, every African American man that I know that's my age just has story after story being pulled over by the cops. I've been pulled over by the cops, but good grief, not 40 times in 18 months, like a man in my church
Right.
is. And where we used to meet, there was a man lynched right there in Texas, North Texas. And so it's real, but just because, in my opinion, someone in the Black Lives Matter movement labels something as systemic racism, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know.
Sure.
But so I'm probably like you. I'm trying to navigate, some of those things. So I'm trying to learn more about it, but I'm certainly not adopting it wholesale. But I'm not saying it's of the devil either.
Sure. Yeah, I'm more on the side of the lack of redeemability on it, which is, I think this is just an in-house kind of insider baseball conversation, which is kind of why I made the podcast in the first place.
Yeah,
honestly. But yeah, I think the conversation of what you just mentioned is really curious to me with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a social science approach to therapy, and then critical race theory. That's the hang up I've had, because I use in pastoral ministry, I use all sorts of tools that when you trace back their roots, well, if we just trace them back to their roots, they don't come from a Christian worldview, so to speak. Right. And so what justifies me using tools? I mean, we can even talk about the Enneagram in that matter. Right.
Yeah.
Which is,
that's real inside baseball.
I know. Right.
I'm super, well, anyway, I'm super cynical on the Enneagram. But yet the Enneagram's great for me because I think a generation younger than me is super, and what are you, a 4, a 7, and I just kind of giggle at all that. But right, and so I'm cynical and Enneagram's dumb. But then when I've taken the Enneagram test, I'm like, ooh, that's really helpful. So
that's funny. But I think it's a similar topic as far as how Christians perceive the usefulness, helpfulness, or even how we employ different
Yeah.
methodologies, tools, resources. My argument with critical race theory is it's not identifying anything I couldn't have identified without a biblical worldview. I
Man,
mean,
that's a great point. Yeah.
is like I've got what I don't want to harp on the sufficiency of scripture to such a degree to where any general revelation is unnecessary. there's
Mm,
there's a there's a real necessity of general revelation we can learn from different disciplines. Thank God that we have all these different resources, technology and stuff from general revelation that we can connect and know
hmm
God
hmm
in a fresh way in that way. But gosh, it hasn't revealed anything to me. And in fact, what I've seen it do is create more division, more hostility.
Yeah.
When I pick up that tool, because really it feels like a sledgehammer. Like I've heard the analogy of
hmm
like, it is a tool, but what is a tool designed for? Well, it's designed to tear down systems of power and oppression.
Right.
And so if we start using it in our churches, is it any wonder that we experience more division, more strife? Now, can we talk about racism, like you said? Can we talk about systemic racism? Can we talk about all these topics? Yeah,
Are,
let's do it.
are
Um,
we? I don't know how much time we have left, but if we're on inside baseball here, um, I think a fair critique of a lot of kind of liberal approaches to these things is they are speaking truth to power in their mind in a way that tears down things. But in reality, there's somewhere in there. Sometimes it's really clear, sometimes it's not. But that is sinful biblical division in the body at times. So, for instance, when you look at um, like what the homosexual agenda has done in denominations in America, they've killed them. So I think they have brought like what happened in the Anglican Church over the last 5 years. I think it's shameful.
right,
And what was the root of that, right? And so I think it's appropriate to say, wait a sec, y'all are supposed to live in community with each other. You care more about this agenda that you have than you do preserving the unity of Jesus's body.
right,
And I think that that's a fair rebuke of that side and of things. And I think, if critical race theory is used in different ways, I think the question, the rebuke of are you being divisive should come out, because I think it's very easy for all of us, left and right, to make our politics our religion.
totally,
And what happens from that is division in our religion, a division in Jesus's bride. Jesus's bride is not the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. That's not Jesus's bride. And so if you can't live in unity and communion with brothers that maybe you have disagreements on some of that, then maybe you're making your politics a religion, and you're
right.
causing division on those grounds. And I think we have a long history of that, especially in the mainline denominations.
For sure. And really, I almost shared this with a friend last week is that uh, really we have Karl Marx in a lot of ways to thank for that because he believed
Mm-hmm.
nothing could be pre-political, that everything was political.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we have a whole generation of people that
Yeah.
only when we read certain words online or hear people say certain words,
Mm-hmm.
we go, what political tribe are you? What tribe are you? And it's like,
Right.
we can't ever have conversations that are upstream from politics because everything
Amen.
has been reduced to politics and power,
Right.
which is shameful and unhelpful.
It is. And Marx is wrong on that. And it's been a poison in our public conversation in 2021. Yeah.
For sure. Well, this has been super helpful. I love this conversation. I could
Mm-hmm.
keep talking about all these different topics. Hopefully, this gives people really a snippet of really what you have to offer. I think you have great thoughts to offer, great presence to offer to the world, and so I'm really thankful that we got to have this conversation in this way. Once again, if you want to enter the giveaway, I've got these Thomas Patient books to give out, and it sounds like they're going to be super helpful on a variety of issues in our world. And so if you want to be entered in the giveaway, all you need to do is comment in the Facebook chat or comment on YouTube. Just leave a comment. The kind of contest or giveaway closes by February 28th. So make sure you comment before then and you'll be entered in the giveaway. And I will mail you a copy of this great book that's sure to bless you. Is there anything else that you wanted to plug on your end, Micah, as far as how people can connect or learn more from you?
Yeah, I'm kind of in the normal places like everybody else on social media. I have a blog that I haven't. 2020 and was just a nutty year in ministry and life, and so I haven't done a lot there lately. But yeah, just kind of the normal ways you can find me. I think the last thing I want to say is just thank you for the opportunity, man. I really love the show. This has been a lot of fun and a blessing. And yeah, thank you again for letting me be on the show today.
Absolutely. It was great having you. If you are a listener and you enjoyed this podcast, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can get these fed to you. I know these come out a little bit irregularly. I've got a full-time job as a pastor, so I can't be as frequent as I want to. And then if you're on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell so you can stay up to date when I do release content. And we will be seeing you next time. Thanks so much for being here today.